Hi, Professor Dater, to anyone else watching. Thanks for coming, I guess, to my capstone presentation as I finish my senior year. So my project is studying New Jersey as a case study of revolution. And what is a revolution? What is a civil war? What is an uprising or rebellion? Your social studies teacher, when discussing the Revolutionary War, may have described it to your class as a narrative of anti colonial resistance or radical new Enlightenment thought versus a medieval monarchy. Even naming the war revolutionary itself acts to advance the narrative of radical new thought against old world tradition. Usage of the term revolution when describing the war can be found in the 1815 letter of John Adams to Thomas Jefferson. Quote, "What do you mean by revolution? The war? That was no part of the revolution. It was only an effect and consequence of it. The revolution was in the minds of the people." End quote. If the war was not the revolution, at least not in the mind of John Adams, then what was it? I wanted to track down the very first usage of revolution to describe the war, but this was the earliest I got, and it isn't very much. And it very much isn't the first usage of the word. So historian T.H. Breen rejects the grand narrative of founding fathers and sons of liberty fighting for their natural rights against an old world tyrannical regime. Naming the war as the Revolution offers a different story as the War of American Independence. One Hessian soldier, a German mercenary for the British, wrote, "The war was not an American rebellion. It was nothing more less than an Irish, Scotch, Presbyterian rebellion." And I bet your social studies teacher didn't describe the war that way. But the Hessian soldier does give a unique European perspective of the war. Focusing in on where the New Jersey and New York and New Jersey colonies differed from New England and Southern colonies were that they were Dutch colonies conquered by the British Empire in 1667. The United Provinces established a complicated system of international trade, banking, insurance, manufacturing, and stock markets, alongside being the sole decentralized liberal government of Europe, promoting intellectual freedom and religious tolerance. Dutch liberal government systems present a clear historical theme of inspiring the revolutionary ideas. However, the Dutch East India Company held political control over the Dutch colonies of New Netherland as corporate entities and did not permit an elected assembly, unlike the British colonies. And the Dutch colonies did welcome many religious dissenters who were rendered unwelcome in New England. So you had a mix of Puritans, Quakers, Lutherans, and Jewish people who immigrated to the Dutch colonies, forming a diverse identity for the Mid-Atlantic region, unique to the other colonies in the area. So prior to the war, the colonies of East and West Jersey were united by 1707, but distinct differences between the two regions of the colony were present during the war. So East Jersey in the green on the right side map was settled primarily by Anglican settlers who held slaves and were tied strongly to the Anglican Church in England. West Jersey, in yellow, was settled primarily by Quakers, and while Anglican colonists made up a prominent minority in West Jersey, Quaker culture dominated the region. Most notably of all was the abolition of slavery in the colony. For example, the residents of Burlington, New Jersey, the capital of West Jersey, were largely loyalist in leanings, due in both to religious connection to England and the fact that British regulars protected residents and their property from Patriot raids. Benjamin Franklin's son, William Franklin, was the last royal governor of New Jersey and held in a strong loyalist. He, alongside Burlington's Anglican priest, had direct personal ties to England, providing royal patronage to the city of Burlington as well. The large Quaker community, in large part alongside Anglicans, held loyalist leanings. So, going more specifically on the Quaker Church decided upon neutrality early in the war, but neutrality is not really ever neutral. And neutrality in this context is generally seen as a loyalist move. And when the New Jersey state legislature pressured men to enlist into the Continental Army and New Jersey state militias, many Quaker men were shunned from their communities upon doing so, excommunicated in a way. Quaker women often served as nurses and doctors for Washington's army during the war, during battles, and also during the brutal winters he quartered in Morristown. Historian Ridron discusses the role of Quaker women, that it was so large that the New Jersey legislature, following the war, enfranchised women who specifically owned 50 pounds in assets. So talking more specifically onto the more political philosophical side, so you have the formation of the Sons of Liberty in Boston, and that spreads pretty throughout the whole 13 colonies. And specifically in New Jersey, you have the formation of the Woodbridge Sons of Liberty chapter in 1766. And it clearly proclaimed disdain for perceived parliamentary overreach of power. But they remained dedicated to constitutional laws, quote, of our mother country, but no other laws or impositions whatsoever, end quote. Radical politics is a spectrum, and to be radical is relative to the time of the politics surrounding the radicals. To reject all laws except constitutional laws would have been radical in 1766. However, the significance of preserving constitutional law, or English common law, was of utmost importance for even the most radical Whigs, also showing a level of philosophical sophistication before and during the war. So as the war progressed, the British captured New York City, and Washington fled to Philadelphia. And following Washington's famous crossing of the Delaware River and the Christmas Battle of Trenton, he moved north to set up his headquarters in Morristown, a small town centrally located in North Jersey. Washington situated himself in a deeply patriotic populace with mountainous terrain for defense and sufficient farmland to support his army. The population of Morristown at the time was written to be about 250 people, but Washington's army numbered 800. But even just to give you more perspective, the British had 32,000 troops just 30 miles away in New York City. So it's kind of a joke how little manpower the Continental Army had, and it was whittled down after about a really brutal winter and the loss of New York. And then you also have a smallpox epidemic, which plagued the Continental Army, just to make matters even worse. And then that following winter, Washington's army suffered what is largely considered to be the worst winter in American history, when you have 26 snowstorms and 6 blizzards in a single winter, which is pretty nuts. And these calamities forced the New Jersey militia to be heavily relied upon in lieu of the actual abilities of the Continental Army. And New Jersey militias largely participated in partisan warfare against loyalist counterparts and harassed British troops collecting supplies or marching through New Jersey. And so to counter the New Jersey militias, the British hired Hessian mercenaries to assist in their efforts. However, their reputation as brutes quickly spread throughout the colony. And Reverend Collins of West Jersey wrote about the ensuing battle that occurred as the state militia were occupying the Swedish settled village of Swedesboro. Quote, "They, British soldiers, burned down the schoolhouse for the simple reason of their friends being kept prisoner there. I remonstrated with them how unchristian and wicked this behavior was, and that it was the worst disservice they could do to their king. The officers agreed to this, but said they were unable to keep proper military discipline." End quote. The officers were not German soldiers, they were British officers, and they couldn't keep military discipline of the German Hessian mercenaries. And this the involvement of Hessian mercenaries shows that there's a shift in support for the revolution by New Jersey colonists at this time, and it is largely due to the behavior of Hessian mercenaries in the colony. And so kind of as the Hessian soldiers are marauding through New Jersey, you have a lot of stories about heroines, and this is a very famous heroine. This image is of Molly Pitcher, who delivered water to men injured at the Battle of Monmouth, which proved to be a major test for Washington and his Continental Army. And when Molly Pitcher's husband is killed in the fighting, she assumes his post and kind of mans or like she takes command over this like cannon and not like saves the day, but kind of is this morale lifting powerful force on the battlefield. And another story of women participating in the war to some capacity. So in April of 1777, we have the story of an anonymous woman who, quote, saw through the window a drunken Hessian soldier who had straggled home from his party. She went home dressed in man's apparel and armed with an old firelock, returned to the house and took the Hessian prisoner, to whom she delivered to the New Jersey regiment, end quote. So, and that's from a local like newspaper talking about whether or not the story is exactly true kind of doesn't matter so much in this context. More so talking about how women were heroines in the use of being an uplifting force during the war, but also how women felt the war personally, and especially in many different ways than the men could have been from the treatment of Hessian soldiers. And such reports prove that New Jersey women were not passive observers in the war, but many, in fact, were active participants in the conflict. New Jersey women were as divided as other elements of society on which side to support, but women participated for the revolution nonetheless. So, from what we currently discussed, how much of this war was revolutionary? The role of women is indicative of what was to come, even if only brief. However, the issue of slavery proved to be extremely divisive in the colony and further muddies the water into the revolutionary element of the war. As you can see in this image, it is the census tally of the number of slaves in each county. And the closer you get to New York City, generally speaking, the more slaves you're going to get. And the farther west you go, the fewer. Kind of, you have that old East and West Jersey divide. Even after the colony was unified into one, there's still a lot more slaves in each region, even if it was completely legal throughout the whole colony. And many New Jersey colonists advocated for the emancipation of slaves. So a New Jersey representative to the Continental Congress, John Cooper, decrying the hypocrisy of the Declaration of Independence, said, quote, "We say all men are created equal, entitled to liberty and the pursuit of happiness, but are we willing to grant this liberty to all men?" End quote. And he kind of shows that contemporaries knew that the ideals of the Declaration of Independence were contradictory to that of slavery. New Jersey would outlaw the slave Atlantic trade in 1786 and begin the gradual manumission of slaves in 1804. But people were enslaved. There was a single individual man enslaved up until the end of the Civil War in New Jersey. So in some capacity, New Jersey was actually a slave state during the Civil War. But the whole issue of slavery and New Jersey's progress towards manumission shows that there was an element of revolutionary vision and progress achieved gradually within the states. On the political side, the New Jersey legislature criticized their inability to count Black men enlistments to the Continental Army as fulfilling the required quota, also citing the Declaration of Independence as the reason to enlist Black men. But it's also not worth withstanding at this point that New Jersey needed the manpower to fight in the war, and it may not have been indicative of their liberalness, more so of a pragmatic need for soldiers. But when you kind of put it into context of other legislative actions of New Jersey during and immediately following the war, you have you have the total enfranchisement, not total, but total enfranchisement of women and free black of property within New Jersey. So black men and women were specifically quoted and written down into laws being able to vote right after the war ended. But it wouldn't last, as reactionaries would become the majority in New Jersey around 1830, with immigration to the state of landless white men from New England seeking cheap farmland, who would then vote to out women and free black men from being able to vote. So they would, the landless white men from New England moved to New Jersey, and then their overwhelming new political base voted out the ability of women and free black men of land to vote. The collective memory of the Revolutionary War as a nation-building event stands in marked contrast to the historical realities of the War of Independence. So the revolutionary elements of the war occurred following the war, not during it. The role of flexible memory in creating a politically beneficial narrative proved a greater importance than that of historical accuracy. A narrative of unification, when under extreme pressure, can prove applicable when needed. Recalling the founding fathers to make political arguments about contemporary politics may be emotionally compelling, but fails to recognize not only the partisan nature of the founding fathers, but the role of less remembered colonists in the nation's creation. Nowhere else was the fate of the war, and subsequently the United States at large, so dependent on local average people. New Jersey during the war is largely forgotten by the larger narrative, as the first shots were not fired there, and neither was the final victory celebrated within its borders. Yet New Jersey and the regular people with diverse identities had a fundamental role in shaping the ethos of what it is to be American. Thank you for coming to my presentation and for being an awesome professor, not only for this class, but also for the class that I took with you last year. It's been great. See you at graduation.